He called his wife the household side, then his empire stopped moving. Maricel Grant was already inside the ballroom when the cameras turned toward the entrance. That was how she knew it had been planned. No one announced it. No one had to. The room simply shifted, the way expensive rooms do when money and attention arrive together. Conversations softened. Champagne glasses paused halfway to mouths. Photographers lifted their cameras toward the double doors of the philanthropy launch Darian Vale had built around his newest luxury development. And then Darian walked in with Simone Hargrove beside him. Not behind him, not arriving separately. Beside him, angled perfectly toward the flashes. One hand resting lightly at the small of her back like she belonged there. Like the place had been waiting for her. Maricel stood near the donor wall with a glass of water she had barely touched. She wore navy silk, pearls at her ears, nothing loud. Nothing pleading. The kind of dress women in those rooms called tasteful when they wanted to compliment restraint without asking what it cost. Across the ballroom, Simone tilted her chin toward the cameras. Her dress caught the light before her face did. Darian smiled the smile business magazines loved. The one that made people say he was self-made, disciplined. Visionary. A man who could turn neglected blocks into destinations. Around Maricel, the meaning landed before anyone said a word. There was the wife, and there was the future. A few guests glanced at Maricel and looked away too quickly. Others looked long enough to measure whether she would flinch. Nobody asked why a separated wife had been left to stand in the same room while her husband introduced another woman, as if she were part of the program. That was the cruelty of it. It didn't come in shouting. It came polished, sponsored, photographed. It came wrapped in foundation grants and scholarship pledges and soft jazz. It came in a room full of people who knew exactly what they were seeing and decided to call it elegance. Maricel did not move. Darian kept smiling. And Simone, bright under every flash, stepped into the place Darian had cleared for her while Maricel was still standing close enough to watch it happen. Darian made his way through the donors slowly, accepting handshakes, touching shoulders, letting people feel chosen for 2 seconds at a time. By the time he reached Maricel, a small pocket of guests had already turned toward them. Not openly. These were people trained to stare without looking rude. A board chair near the flowers pretended to study her program. 2 photographers drifted closer. Darian leaned in with that smooth public warmth of his. "Mrs. Vale," he said. Not Maricel, Mrs. Vale. The title landed like a white glove over a slap. Respectful enough that no one could object. Cold enough that she felt the distance in every syllable. His hand stayed at Simone's back. Maricel looked at him. Then at the fingers resting there, then back to his face. He knew she saw it. That was part of why he kept them there. "Darian," she said. Her voice was even. Not sweet. Not sharp, just even. A donor beside him smiled too hard. "It's so good to see everyone being so graceful about this season of change." Maricel let the woman's sentence hang there, soft and ugly. Darian gave a small laugh, the kind that told the room everything was under control. Maricel has always understood decorum. Simone's smile did not move. But her eyes flicked over Maricel's dress, her pearls, the careful stillness of her hands. Maricel felt the room waiting for her to give them a scene. A raised voice, a trembling lip. Something they could file away as proof that Darian had outgrown difficulty and moved toward light. She gave them nothing. That seemed to please him even more. Because in that moment, Darian had done more than greet her. He had put her back inside a name that belonged to him. He had made her sound dignified and harmless at the same time. Like a framed portrait from the old house that nobody had the heart to take down yet. A society interviewer caught Simone near the step and repeat a few minutes later, where the lighting was kinder and the Vale Urban Resorts logo repeated behind her in gold. Simone turned her face slightly before answering, checking her angle in the dark reflection of a camera lens. "You and Darian seem very aligned tonight," the interviewer said. "Should people expect to see more of you in this new chapter?" Simone laughed softly, as if the question embarrassed her in the prettiest possible way. "I think Darian is building something that needs forward energy," she said, "and I'm honored to support that. Everyone has a previous chapter. What matters is knowing when the next one is ready." Previous chapter. Maricel heard it from 10 feet away. A living wife, 11 years married, turned into a phrase for a caption. The interviewer smiled like Simone had said something graceful. A few guests nodded. Someone near the bar murmured, "She's good on camera." Darian stood close enough to correct it. He didn't. He adjusted his cuff, glanced toward Simone with approval, and let the phrase settle over the room. That was what made it worse. Not Simone's ambition, not even her pretty little insult dressed up as branding. It was Darian's silence beside it, his permission. Maricel watched him watch Simone. Once, years ago, Darian had listened to Maricel talk through Project Risk at their kitchen table, leaning forward like her caution was brilliance. He had called her steady then. He had said her mind could see around corners. Now he stood under soft lights and allowed another woman to speak of her like she was something he had finished reading. Simone's laugh floated through the microphone. The room accepted it. And Maricel understood that Darian had not just moved on. He had invited people to applaud the moving. Tessa Whitcomb stood with 3 board members near the champagne station. One eyebrow lifted above her flute like she had been born judging silk napkins and family names. "She's handling it beautifully," Tessa said, her voice low enough to pretend discretion and clear enough to travel. Maricel has always been so graciously low profile. One of the women glanced toward Maricel. "Do you think she ever liked all this?" Tessa gave a small, careful shrug. Some women are simply more suited to the private side of a man's life. Darian built a very visible world. That takes a certain appetite. The words were smooth. Almost complimentary, almost. Maricel stood still while they turned her restraint into absence. They looked at a black woman who had learned not to spill family matters across polished floors, who had been raised by women who wrote things down and kept their word, and decided quiet meant small, not disciplined, not careful, not powerful in a way they did not recognize. Just low profile. Darian laughed at something across the room, his voice carrying easily. Simone touched his sleeve, and the nearest photographer caught it. Tessa's group turned toward them like sunflowers finding the light. "There's an ease there," one board member said. "There is." Tessa agreed. "It feels current." Current. Maricel took a slow breath through her nose. She had heard versions of this all her life in rooms where black women were praised for grace, only when grace meant making other people comfortable. If she defended herself, she would be difficult. If she stayed composed, she would be forgettable. If she claimed what was hers, someone would call it bitterness before they called it truth. Tessa lifted her glass toward Darian as if blessing the new arrangement. And just like that, the room began helping him do what he had started. Maricel had stepped away from the center of the ballroom when Darian's assistant found her near a side table stacked with pledge cards. He was young, polished, nervous around the edges. The kind of assistant Darian liked because he knew how to say unpleasant things in a pleasant voice. "Mrs. Vale," he said. Maricel looked at him until he corrected himself with a small cough. "Ms. Grant, sorry." He held out a cream envelope, thick enough to announce money before anyone opened it. "Mr. Vale wanted you to have this tonight. He thought it might be helpful to review a generous path forward before the press starts making things uncomfortable." Maricel did not take it right away. Behind him, across the room, Darian stood with Simone and a circle of donors. He was turned just enough to see the exchange, not staring. Darian never stared when he could supervise. The assistant lowered his voice. "He really does want this to stay respectful." Respectful. Maricel almost smiled at that. She had been made to watch his girlfriend enter on his arm. She had heard herself called a previous chapter. She had listened while society women turned her life into a tasteful footnote. And now, away from the cameras, a man on Darian's payroll was offering her an envelope like the marriage could be closed out before dessert. "What did he tell you this was?" she asked. The assistant shifted his weight. "A settlement framework." "A framework. For comfort," he added too quickly. "And privacy." There it was. Money and silence. The two things men like Darian offered when they wanted a woman to disappear cleanly. Maricel looked past him once more. Darian's smile widened as if he could already see her accepting it. Then she reached for the envelope. Maricel held the cream envelope for one quiet second. Then she turned it over. looked at the sealed flap, and set it on the table beside the pledge cards without opening it. The assistant blinked. "I'm sorry, did you want me to wait while you review it?" "No," Maricel said. From her clutch, she took out a small red leather ledger, worn soft at the corners. It did not match the room. That was why she trusted it. Her grandmother had carried one like it for years, filled with names, dates, promises, and the kind of details people later swore they never said. Maricel uncapped her pen. "What's your name?" she asked. The assistant straightened. "Caleb. Last name?" A quick nervous glance toward Darian. "Reeves." Maricel wrote it down. "Caleb Reeves. 9:42 p. M. Cream envelope delivered at Vale Philanthropy Launch." Then, word for word, she added what he had said. A generous path forward. Before the press starts making things uncomfortable. Caleb watched her hand move across the page. "Miss Grant, I don't think Mr. Vale meant for this to be formal. That's usually when writing it down matters most." His mouth opened, then closed. Maricel tore nothing out. She made no threat. She simply closed the ledger, slid it back into her clutch, and picked up the envelope by its edge. "Please return this to Darian." Caleb looked trapped between instruction and common sense. "Untouched?" "Untouched." He accepted it with both hands like the envelope had grown heavier. Across the room, Darian's smile thinned, only a little. Enough for Maricel to see he had expected her to read it. Maybe even tremble over it. Maybe calculate what her silence was worth. She gave him none of that. She gave him a record. Darian waited less than 3 minutes. He crossed the room without looking like he was crossing it for her. He stopped at Maricel's side with a smile still arranged for anyone watching. Close enough that his words belonged only to her. "Maricel." She turned her head. "Darian." His eyes dropped briefly to her bag, where the ledger had disappeared. Then he removed his rimless glasses, took a pocket square from his jacket and began polishing one lens with slow, practiced care. "Let's be adult about optics," he said. There it was. The voice he used when he had already decided he was reasonable and everyone else was a problem. Maricel said nothing. Darian kept the smile in place. Tonight is important. For the foundation, for the company, for people who don't need to be dragged into personal discomfort. "Personal discomfort," she repeated. His jaw tightened, but only for a second. "You know what I mean?" "I'm not sure I do." A couple nearby laughed too loudly at something unrelated, but their bodies had tilted toward them. Simone stood by the photographer wall, pretending not to watch. Darian slid the glasses back on. "I'm trying to make this clean, respectful. You returning documents through staff sends the wrong message. You sent them through staff." His smile thinned. "That was courtesy," he said. "I didn't want you blindsided." Maricel looked at him then, really looked. At the man who had brought another woman into a room where his wife stood. At the man who wanted gratitude for passing humiliation through an assistant. Darian leaned in a fraction. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The words were soft, that made them uglier. He was not asking her how she was. He was not apologizing. He was not even pretending shame. He was warning her to protect the picture he had painted over her life. Maricel's face did not change, but something in her went still in a cleaner way than before. Darian thought silence meant room to press. He had never understood that silence could also be a door closing. For a moment, Maricel said nothing. That silence was dangerous in a room like that. People filled silence with whatever served them. Pride, jealousy, bitterness. A woman's wounded little refusal to accept that she had been replaced. Darian seemed to think she was searching for a softer answer. She wasn't. She looked him directly in the face and said, "Be careful what you ask people to decide after you disrespect them." His expression barely changed, but something cold moved behind his eyes. Nearby, Tessa Whitcomb had gone still with her champagne flute lifted near her mouth. 2 men in dinner jackets pretended to study the donor list. Everyone wanted the sentence to mean something small enough to gossip about. Darian gave a low chuckle. "That sounds dramatic." "No," Maricel said. "It sounds careful." Then she stepped around him. She did not storm off. She did not turn back. She did not raise her voice for the satisfaction of people waiting to call her angry. Behind her, one of the men murmured, "She's proud." Tessa answered, surprisingly composed considering. Considering what? No one had to say. Considering Simone. Considering the cameras. Considering the envelope. Considering the nerve of a black woman refusing to crumble politely after being dressed down in silk and candlelight. Maricel heard enough. She kept walking. Her hands were steady. But not because the words had missed her. They had landed. Every glance had landed. Every careful little compliment with a knife tucked inside had landed. She simply refused to bleed where they could enjoy it. Darian recovered fast. Men like him always did when the room was watching. He moved toward a major donor and one of his company advisors with Simone at his side. His smile widened back into place, and his voice picked up that easy business rhythm people trusted when they wanted to believe wealth meant competence. "No concern there," he said, as if answering a question Maricel had not heard. "The business side is secure. We're just cleaning up the household side." Maricel stopped near the edge of a floral arrangement. "The household side." The donor nodded, relieved to have the personal matter placed somewhere small and tidy. The advisor gave a little laugh, the kind people use when the boss has made disrespect safe. Simone looked down, smiling into her glass. Darian kept going. Transitions like this can look more complicated from the outside than they are. But the company is strong. The vision is unchanged. The company, the vision, the side. He spoke as though marriage had been a room in his penthouse he was ready to renovate. As though years of counsel at kitchen tables, introductions made quietly, warnings given before risk became crisis, were all curtains in china and gala seating charts. Maricel felt the phrase settle into her body differently than the others. Mrs. Vale had been a cage. Previous chapter had been a slap. But household side was erasure with witnesses who understood money. Darian was not only humiliating her socially. He was telling business people she had never belonged anywhere near the foundation of what he built. The advisor said, "Good to hear. Investors don't like domestic uncertainty." "Exactly," Darian replied, "and I don't let domestic uncertainty touch operations." Maricel looked at him then, not with shock, with memory. When Darian walked to the small stage, the room followed him gladly. A staff member handed him a microphone. Simone took her place beside him. Close enough to be photographed, careful enough not to look like she was trying too hard. Behind them, the Vale Urban Resorts logo glowed against a wall of white flowers. Darian lifted his glass. "Tonight is about legacy," he began. Of course it was. Darian loved that word when other people could not see whose legacy had opened the first doors. He thanked donors. He praised the city. He spoke of excellence, ownership, expansion, and the responsibility of building beautiful things where people had once expected neglect. The room listened the way rooms listened to men who knew how to make ambition sound like service. Then his tone softened. "And as many of you know, this is also a season of transition in my personal life." A hush moved through the guests. Not surprise, permission. Darian reached slightly toward Simone without quite touching her. New eras require honesty. They require grace. They require all of us to release old roles with gratitude, so the work can continue at its highest level. Applause began before he finished. Maricel stood near the back, holding her clutch with both hands, old roles. With gratitude. There it was, finally said in front of everyone. He had not brought Simone by accident. He had not let Tessa talk by accident. He had not sent the envelope because the timing was unfortunate. He had built the evening so the city's polished people would help him turn a wife into an outdated role and call her disappearance gracious. Simone lowered her eyes at the applause, playing humble. Cameras flashed. Darian smiled like a man receiving a blessing. The room gave it to him. They applauded the new era. They applauded the replacement. They applauded Maricel's expected vanishing as if it were good manners. And Maricel understood, with a clarity so clean it almost steadied her, that this was not a separation. It was a disposal. Maricel left before the toast turned into a photograph. She knew that was what came next. Darian would lift his glass. Simone would lean in. Tessa would write something about modern grace and dignified transitions. And if Maricel stayed, she would become part of the background in the picture of her own replacement. She would not give him that. At the edge of the ballroom, she paused beside a narrow console table, opened her clutch, and took out the red ledger again. The applause behind her rose and softened. She wrote carefully, household side. She added the time, the names nearby, the setting. She did not press hard enough to tear the page, though her hand wanted to. A woman passing toward the restroom gave her a pitying smile. "You're so strong," the woman whispered, as if strength were a nice word for public abandonment. Maricel closed the ledger. Across the room, Darian saw her near the exit. For one brief moment their eyes met over the heads of donors and board members. His expression said he believed he had won the evening, that she had retreated, that silence meant acceptance. Simone touched his arm, drawing him back into the circle of light. Maricel turned away. The hallway outside the ballroom was cooler, quieter, lined with framed photographs from past charity events. She walked alone, her heels steady against the marble. No one followed. No one stopped her. No one asked what it cost to leave with dignity when every person inside had been invited to misunderstand it. At the doors, she did not look back. Behind her, Darian's new era kept applauding. In her bag, the ledger held what the room thought it had gotten away with. By morning, the story had learned how to dress itself. Tessa Whitcomb's column went up just after 7, timed perfectly for donors, board members, and women drinking coffee after school drop-off. The headline praised Darian Vale's graceful new era. The first photo showed him and Simone under the white flowers. His glass raised, her face turned toward him like faith. Maricel sat at the small kitchen table in the Grant family home and read it without touching her coffee. Tessa called Simone poised. She called Darian visionary. And Maricel, when she appeared in the third paragraph, was described as graciously low profile. A phrase so polished it almost hid the insult from anyone who had not lived inside that kind of language. Almost. The column said Maricel had attended with quiet dignity as Darian introduced a new season of growth. It said nothing about the envelope. Nothing about the hand at Simone's back. Nothing about old roles or household sides. Nothing about a wife standing in a room while strangers practiced replacing her in real time. Maricel scrolled once, then stopped. There were comments already. So mature. Love seeing black excellence handle change with class. Simone brings such fresh energy. Maricel set the phone face down. That was how a lie hardened. Not all at once. Not with one cruel headline. It hardened in pretty words people repeated because they sounded harmless. It hardened when a black woman's silence was mistaken for consent. Then praised as proof she knew her place. Outside, the old house was quiet. Restored wood floors, family photographs, her grandmother's china in the cabinet. A home that remembered who she was even when the city pretended not to. But the city had already begun carrying Darian's version without her. By that afternoon, Simone's post was everywhere. Maricel saw it on her phone while sitting at the kitchen table, one thumb resting on the edge of the screen. The photos were soft, golden, expensive looking, Simone in perfect light. Darian tagged in the caption like an achievement. Choosing chapters that match your elevation. That was the line. And underneath it, comments kept stacking up. So true. She fits him now. This is the energy. Maricel stared at the screen longer than she wanted to. Not because she didn't understand it, because she did. That was what made it sting. The whole thing had been turned into a lifestyle moment. Like replacing a woman was just part of curating the right look. Darian's name was under every photo, even when he wasn't speaking. Simone was smiling at a table Maricel had once helped choose for a gala. Simone was leaning close enough to look claimed. Simone was getting praised for looking like she belonged in Darian's world, while Maricel's years in that world were being treated like a bad fit. The phone buzzed again. Another notification. Another stranger saying the same thing in a different way. Maricel locked the screen and set it down gently. She didn't cry. She didn't throw the phone. She just sat there with her jaw tight and her face still, watching a woman she had never met get applauded for standing where Maricel had once stood with love, patience, and a name nobody in that comment section bothered to remember. Darian did not call Maricel himself. That would have suggested he owed her a conversation. Instead, near noon, his assistant Caleb sent a message with the clean, Careful tone of a man typing under supervision. Mr. Vale is available Thursday at 2 for settlement review. He believes it would be best for all parties to move forward promptly and privately. Please confirm. A second message followed before Maricel answered. Mrs. Vale, Mr. Vale would appreciate your cooperation in keeping this process respectful. There it was again. The title pulled out when it served him. Not because Darian honored the marriage. Because Mrs. Vale sounded softer than Maricel Grant. Easier to manage. Easier to file under family matter. In Darian's office, he stood over Caleb's shoulder while the message went out. His jacket was off, sleeves rolled just enough to look hardworking. On the glass wall behind him, the Atlanta skyline made him look like exactly the man the magazines described. Caleb glanced up. Do you want to ask if that time works for her? Darian gave him a look. It's a meeting time. Not a lunch invitation. Caleb nodded and lowered his eyes to the screen. Darian picked up his glasses from the desk, wiped one lens with his pocket square, and said, She had her moment last night. Let's not encourage performance. Performance. That was what he called it when a woman did not accept humiliation on schedule. He turned toward the window, already moving on in his mind. To him, silence meant she was tired. The returned envelope meant she wanted a better number. The lack of public response meant the gala had worked. He did not imagine that Maricel might be quiet because she was exact. He only imagined that she was ready to be processed. When Maricel got home, the house was quiet enough to hear the refrigerator hum. She set her keys down, took off her shoes, and sat at the kitchen table with the ledger in front of her. The red leather was worn smooth where her grandmother's hand had touched it for years. Maricel opened it to a fresh page and wrote the date first. Like she always did when something needed to be kept exactly right. Then she wrote Tessa Wickham's words, graciously low profile. Then Simone's caption, choosing chapters that match your elevation. Then Darian's message about the meeting. She wrote each line the way it had come, without softening any of it. No paraphrasing, no mercy. Just the facts because facts didn't change when people got comfortable lying. At the bottom of the page, she added the line from the gala. The household side. Maricel paused with the pen still in her hand. The room around her didn't answer. It didn't defend her. It didn't explain anything away. It just held her while she sat with the hurt and refused to let it turn into confusion. This was what people never understood about her silence. She was not empty. She was exact. She closed the ledger and laid her palm on top of it for a second. Breathing through her nose, steadying herself on the weight of what she had already preserved. Lenora came by before sunset, carrying a covered dish and that look that said she had already decided to tell the truth whether anybody liked it or not. She set the dish on the counter, then turned and studied Maricel over her glasses. Now hear me with both ears, she said. Maricel gave a tired little nod and leaned back against the table. Lenora didn't waste time. You keep letting these people talk like this. They'll write the whole story for you. And you know what happens to a black woman in a divorce mess when the room gets to label her first. Maricel looked down at the ledger. I know. No, baby, I mean really no. Lenora folded her arms. They'll call you bitter if you speak. They'll call you weak if you don't. And if you keep quiet too long, the lie gets to sit in the chair like it pays rent. That landed. Maricel's mouth tightened. Lenora softened a little. But only a little. Your grandmother taught you privacy for a reason. That don't mean self-erasure. There's a difference. Maricel rubbed her thumb along the edge of the table. I'm trying not to make this uglier than it already is. I know you are. Lenora reached over and touched her wrist. But sometimes ugly is what it looks like when people are finally told no. Maricel let that sit there. Lenora picked up the dish again. You're allowed to protect your name and your peace. Just don't let respectability become a cage. Evelyn Price did not offer Maricel any small talk. She took one look at the ledger, the untouched envelope, and the printed meeting request Darian's team had pushed across the table, then sat down in silence and marked the papers with a violet fountain pen. Maricel watched her work. Evelyn tapped one line, then another. Not dramatic, not rushed, just exact. Do they think this is a normal divorce ask? Evelyn said at last. Maricel's expression didn't change. They think money makes it normal. Evelyn gave a short, dry sound that was almost a laugh. That explains the confidence. She turned one page toward Maricel and tapped the margin. This part here. He wants access confirmed as if it belongs to him already. Maricel's eyes moved over the line. Evelyn looked up. That's not a settlement request. That's a reach. The word sat in the room for a second. Maricel folded her hands together. I wasn't sure if I was seeing it too clearly. No. Evelyn capped the pen. You were seeing it correctly. He is overplaying his hand. That was the first time anyone had said it out loud like that. Not he's hurt. Not he's confused. Not this will pass. Overplaying his hand. Maricel leaned back a little, the tension in her shoulders easing by a fraction. For the first time since the gala, it felt like somebody else had stepped into the room and seen the same thing she saw. Evelyn set the papers aside and looked at Maricel directly. What exactly does he think he's buying? She asked. Maricel let out a slow breath. He thinks this is about money. He always thinks that first. And it isn't. No, Maricel shook her head once. It's land. It's old promises. It's access people in his world never even noticed was being kept open for them. Evelyn stayed very still. Maricel kept going because once she started naming it, she couldn't pretend it was small anymore. My grandmother's people held on to things for a reason. Not for show. Not so some man could build a prettier hotel and act like he invented the ground under it. Evelyn's eyes narrowed a little, not in doubt but in recognition. So when he asks me to be quiet, Maricel said, he's not just asking me to move on. He's asking me to give up obligations that were never his to take. There it was. Plain enough that nobody in the room could hide behind vague language anymore. Evelyn nodded once. Then he's not asking for peace. He's asking you to help him lie. Maricel looked down at her hands. That was exactly it. Not a misunderstanding, not hurt feelings. A lie with paperwork behind it. In Darian's office, nobody looked worried enough for what was sitting on the table. Marcus Bellamy sat across from him with his tablet open. While two other advisors waited for Darian to stop acting like this was an inconvenience instead of a problem. Darian read the note from Evelyn, set it down, and smiled like he'd been mildly insulted by a restaurant reservation. Maricel's being emotional, he said, but she's practical. She's settled once she sees the number. Marcus didn't answer right away. Darian leaned back, polished one lens of his glasses with his pocket square, and kept talking. The household side always looks bigger when people are in their feelings. We just need to keep the optics clean and move forward. One of the advisors shifted in his chair. Another looked down at the tablet. Marcus said carefully, the issue may not be just the number. Darian's smile held, but only barely. It usually is. Not this time, Marcus tapped the screen. Some of the language he's questioning touches assumptions we haven't looked at closely enough. Darian waved that off. Then get another confirmation. Marcus held his gaze. From who? For the first time, Darian didn't answer right away. He picked up the note again, scanned it, and then scoffed. She's making this harder because Simone's in the picture. That's all this is. The room went quiet. Darian looked from one face to another, annoyed now that nobody seemed ready to nod with him. She wants attention, he said. That's what this is. But the way he said it sounded less certain than before. Evelyn didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She sat across from Maricel, looked at the papers one more time, and said, he's not asking for a divorce. He's asking you to pretend rights your family protected are his to buy. Maricel's face stayed calm, but her fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Evelyn tapped the page. This part here. This part here. 2. He wants silence, access, and a clean story that makes him look generous. And he wants all of it as if Grant-held land and family promises are just extra property he picked up in the marriage. Maricel looked down at the documents. Can he make it sound that simple? No, Evelyn said. But he can try if nobody pushes back. That hit harder than anger would have. Not because Maricel didn't already know he was disrespectful. Because now it had a shape. A line, a paper trail. A place where his arrogance stopped and her family's authority began. Evelyn leaned back. You are not dealing with a husband who wants peace. You're dealing with a man who thinks money can rewrite what he never bothered to understand. Maricel took a slow breath and let it out through her nose. For the first time since the gala, the humiliation had something solid to run into. Maricel sent the answer through Evelyn and left the rest alone. No rushed meeting, no private rescue. No friendly conversation with Darian while he pretended the issue was just a misunderstanding between people who used to sleep in the same house. Evelyn typed the response while Maricel watched. All requests in writing. No informal confirmation. No treatment of grant obligations as marital property. No discussion outside proper channels. That was the whole thing. Plain enough to read twice and impossible to wiggle around. By the time the message went out, Simone had already posted again. And Tessa had already followed up with another neat little line about Maricel's grace under pressure. Out in the world, the lie was still growing roots. But in this room, it had hit a wall. Maricel folded her hands in her lap and looked at the blank space on Evelyn's screen after the message went. She knew what this would cost. People would call her cold, uncooperative, proud, maybe bitter if they needed a word that made them feel comfortable. She didn't care enough to answer them tonight. What mattered was that Darian no longer got to treat her silence like surrender. Evelyn closed the laptop. That should slow him down. It should, Maricel said. And it did more than that. It turned the whole thing from a hurt husband's tantrum into a formal problem he couldn't charm his way through anymore. By morning, Evelyn's response was sitting on the desks of Darian's lawyers. It was short enough to make the problem sharper, not softer. The meeting was off, and Darian's side would have to name exactly what access they thought Maricel was supposed to surrender. Maricel sat with Evelyn while the message went out, her posture straight. Her expression unreadable. She wasn't chasing him. She wasn't fighting for attention. She was putting a line in place and leaving it there. Evelyn folded her hands. Now it's in writing. He can't pretend this is just emotions. Maricel nodded once. Outside, Darian could still tell the world whatever version he wanted. But inside the process, inside the paperwork, he'd been forced to face a simple fact. Maricel was not giving anything away just because he asked like he already owned it. Darian read Evelyn's response twice. Then he leaned back in his chair, took off his glasses, and polished one lens with the edge of his pocket square like the problem was smudged glass instead of his own overreach. She's making this dramatic, he said. Marcus Bellamy sat across from him. Quiet in the way careful men get quiet when they know a room is about to get worse. Darian didn't notice, or didn't care. She's turning the household side into theater because Simone's in the picture. Darian said, that's all this is. A little attention move. One of the lawyers opened his mouth, then closed it again. Darian slid the glasses back on and looked at them like he was doing them a favor by staying calm. We're not going to let her drag this out over feelings. Marcus glanced at the papers, then at Darian. It doesn't read like feelings. Darian gave a short laugh. Because you're all too close to it. That was his answer for everything. If Maricel resisted, she was emotional. If she stayed quiet, she was manageable. If the documents didn't cooperate, then the documents must be the problem. He still didn't understand that the more he dismissed her, the less room he left himself to move. Darian didn't like being slowed down, he liked deciding. He liked handing people a number and watching them adjust their lives around it. So when the response came back firmer than he expected, he did what he always did. He spent more. Raise it. He told his lawyer. And put a silence clause in it. The lawyer hesitated. You want that in writing? Yes, Darian said. I want this done cleanly. He turned toward his assistant. Send it through you. Tell her we're trying to help her stay comfortable after the marriage. Comfortable. As if that word could cover being replaced in public, and then offered a check to disappear quietly. Marcus watched him from the other side of the desk. Not speaking. He was good at that part. Good at looking like he was just tracking the numbers when really he was watching Darian make the same mistake in a sharper suit. Darian rubbed his jaw. If she wants to play hard to get, fine, but she's not walking away from this empty-handed. That was the thing. He still thought the problem was price. He still thought there was a number that could replace respect. Evelyn laid Darian's revised offer on the table beside the grant records and Maricel's ledger. She didn't have to make the comparison dramatic. The pages did that on their own. Here, she said, tapping the offer. He wants Maricel to confirm access to the coastal property and the delivery routes. Maricel looked at the line, then at Evelyn. That's not his. No, Evelyn said. It belongs to the grant structure. He's asking you to hand over a door he didn't build. The room felt smaller after that. Maricel sat back, one hand resting against the ledger in her lap. The thing Darian was pushing for wasn't just money. It wasn't just a settlement. He was asking her to betray the family work that had held steady long before he ever knew how to pronounce the names on the land. Evelyn flipped another page. He's written this like he thinks everything he needs can be bought at the right price. Maricel gave a slow, disbelieving shake of her head. For the first time, the shape of his mistake was clear. He hadn't just insulted her. He had reached for something her family had kept open. And he was acting like silence would make the theft look civilized. Maricel didn't hesitate. She looked at Evelyn and said, "Then write back that I'm not promising access. Silence or cooperation on anything tied to grant land or family agreements without proper approval on my side." Evelyn held her gaze for a beat, then nodded once. Good. Maricel's jaw stayed tight. She knew what that would look like to Darian. Bitter, difficult, hard to deal with. That was always the risk when a black woman stopped making herself smaller for somebody else's comfort. But backing down would mean something worse. It would mean letting his insult become fact. Evelyn began marking the papers again. He needs you to play along. That's the whole trick. Maricel looked down at the ledger in her lap. Then he's not getting play along. That was the turn. Quiet but final. Not a scene, not a speech. Just a decision. She was done pretending his convenience mattered more than the responsibilities her family put in her hands. One of Darian's lawyers found the problem first. He was thumbing through the refinancing packet, expecting a clean stack of approvals, when he hit a coastal resort expansion file that clearly assumed grant access would keep rolling the way it always had. But the confirmation Darian had promised was nowhere in the company folder. Not missing by accident. Missing in a way that made the whole package wobble. He looked up from the papers, then back down. Then across the desk at the legal staff like maybe somebody else could explain why a file built on certainty was suddenly built on air. This was supposed to be signed off already, he said. Nobody answered right away. Because now it wasn't just a divorce problem. It was a lender problem, a deadline problem, a problem with Darian's name on it. For the first time, one of his own people had to say it out loud. The thing Darian had treated like background depended on Maricel's side confirming what he did not own. Marcus took the file back to his desk and started checking the numbers himself. He tapped bond yield figures into his phone, glanced at the refinance checklist, then frowned when he got to the same missing piece again. A divorce response from Maricel's lawyer was holding up a project Darian had been bragging was already secure. Marcus sat back in his chair. This wasn't a personal annoyance. It wasn't gossip, and it wasn't just Darian being irritated that Maricel wasn't moving when he wanted her to move. This was lender-facing, risk-facing, the kind of thing that could make people stop smiling on calls. He looked over at the lawyer. Why is this still open? The lawyer shrugged a little too fast. Because we don't have the confirmation. Marcus nodded once, slowly. There it was. Not a rumor. Not a mood. A real business problem tied directly to the woman Darian kept talking about like she was background noise. Marcus stared at the page a second longer than he needed to. Then he knew the question Darian had been avoiding was the wrong one. It wasn't whether Maricel was making trouble. It was what else she controlled that nobody in Darian's world had bothered to respect. Darian heard the silence in the room and decided, as usual, that confidence could do the work of proof. He leaned back in his chair and gave Marcus that easy, dismissive smile he used when he wanted people to think a problem was already handled. Maricel's not going to jeopardize the company, he said. She likes her life comfortable. Marcus didn't move. Neither did the lawyers. Darian kept going anyway. Just keep the refinance moving. I'll handle Mrs. Vale personally if I need to. There it was again. Mrs. Vale when he wanted softness. The household side when he wanted distance. A wife when he wanted access. An inconvenience when he wanted freedom. Marcus glanced down at the file, then back at Darian. The man was still talking like status could substitute for documentation. Like old marital habits gave him rights over a woman who had already stopped playing his game. Darian didn't understand why the room had gone tight around him. He still looked like he was in control. But the missing proof on the table said otherwise. Darian didn't bother calling Marisol like an equal. He left a voice message instead. His tone was smooth, measured, almost tired, like he was the reasonable one in a situation somebody else had made difficult. "You're letting pride interfere with people who have nothing to do with our marriage," he said. "These are business people. Adults protect optics before outsiders start asking questions." Marisol sat very still when she heard it. That was the part he always got wrong. He thought if he kept his voice calm, the disrespect would sound mature. He thought if he said optics instead of control, pressure somehow turned into leadership. But the message was plain. He wanted her to keep covering for him. He wanted her to help him look steady while he was the one who had already replaced her in public. Evelyn took the phone from Marisol and listened once, then handed it back. "This is useful," she said quietly. Marisol looked at her. "Useful how?" Evelyn didn't blink. Because now he said the quiet part out loud. "He's tying your silence to his business." Evelyn moved fast after that. The notice she sent Darian's counsel was short enough to leave no room for games. No informal confirmations, no signatures, no access assurances, no silence attached to grant-controlled rights. If Darian wanted anything, his side would have to say exactly what it was asking for and exactly who had the authority to give it. That was the part he couldn't stand. Not the refusal itself. The formality of it. Because once something was in writing, he couldn't smile it away. He couldn't talk around it over drinks. He couldn't send an assistant with a polished envelope and a polite lie. Marisol sat with Evelyn while the response went out, and she knew exactly what it meant. If Darian wanted to keep pretending this was just a private separation, he would have to do it against a paper trail that said otherwise. Evelyn folded her hands after the email left. Now he has to respect the line or cross it in front of everybody. Marisol looked at the phone in her lap. "He'll hate that." "Good," Evelyn said. "It means the boundary landed." Marcus finally had to say it to Darian himself. They were standing in the middle of the executive floor, with the legal team behind them and the refinance paperwork spread across the table like a bad verdict waiting to be read. "The deal can't be presented cleanly," Marcus said. "Not while it depends on grant-controlled access Marisol hasn't confirmed." Darian stared at him. "We've got other assets." "Not for this piece." Marcus tapped the page. "This file assumes her side will keep the access open. Your public story says she's just the household side. The numbers don't agree." That landed harder than anything Evelyn had sent. Because now it wasn't a lawyer saying no. It was his own finance chief saying the company couldn't keep promising what Marisol had not agreed to support. Darian's jaw tightened. "You're overcomplicating this." "No," Marcus said. "I'm telling you the truth. The divorce terms and the business promises are tied together whether you like it or not." For a second nobody moved. Then Darian looked back at the page and saw it the way Marcus had seen it. His contempt had crossed into his empire. And now the empire was starting to feel it. Darian didn't take that well. He never did when the facts stopped flattering him. "Find another path," he snapped at Marcus. "Pressure Evelyn harder. If Marisol wants to act difficult, then we'll deal with difficult." He turned to one of the lawyers. "And I want her framed properly. Make it clear she's making this about money." That was when Simone's team got dragged into it. Darian wanted the language out there before the story turned on him. He wanted people hearing that Marisol was bitter, impossible, greedy, emotional, anything but right. Marcus watched him talk and saw the same thing everybody else in the room was beginning to see. Whether they said it or not, Darian was not solving the problem. He was trying to bury it under image. The refinance stayed unresolved. The missing confirmation stayed missing. And Darian, instead of facing the fact that Marisol's authority was real, chose to make her look unreasonable for refusing to hand him what he had no right to demand. Marcus didn't announce the review as a crisis. He knew better than that. He sent 2 quiet messages before 8 in the morning. One to legal and one to finance, asking for every active project that touched the same kind of grant access as the stalled coastal refinance. No drama, no big subject line, just enough urgency to make people answer fast. By 10, the first folders were on his screen. At first, He expected one messy file, one missing confirmation, one place where Darian had promised more than the company could prove. Then another folder opened, then another. Marisol Grant's name appeared in old correspondence. The Grant Trust appeared in land notes. A supplier memo referenced a relationship nobody in the executive suite had bothered to question because things had always worked. Marcus sat back slowly. One gap could be managed. A pattern was different. A finance analyst leaned into his office. "Do you want us to keep going?" Marcus looked at the file names stacking up on his screen. "Yes," he said. "Everything tied to grant access." "Pull it all." The analyst nodded and disappeared. Marcus picked up his phone, opened the market app out of habit, then closed it without checking a single number. For once, the market wasn't the thing making him nervous. The department heads came in guarded, already sensing they were being asked something they didn't want to answer. Marcus didn't waste time. He asked about delivery windows, dock access, supplier timing, and why so many luxury site promises had kept holding when the schedule was tight and the city was full of delays. At first they gave the usual polished answers. Then one of them sighed and admitted it. Grant relationships had kept things smooth. Another one said the preferred suppliers had always responded faster when Marisol's side was in the loop. A third explained that certain access points got approved because people on the other end trusted the Grant name. Nobody had thought of it as Marisol's work because Marisol was never the one standing on stage talking about it. But once the words were out, there was no putting them back. The trucks had come in. The kitchens had opened. The guests had been served on time. And a lot of that stability had been held together by the woman Darian kept calling the household side. Now the staff could see it. And Marcus could feel the whole floor shifting under them. Marcus tried to keep the request narrow. He told company counsel, "Ask Evelyn Price for clarification. Nothing broad. Just whether Marisol's side will confirm existing access while the larger issues get sorted." Counsel made the call, then sent the email exactly that way. Evelyn's answer came back before lunch. It was polite. It was precise. And Marcus could almost see the violet ink in the way every sentence landed. Marisol would not approve informal favors. She would not provide backdated comfort. She would not quietly keep access open while Darian's team publicly painted her as greedy, bitter, or unreasonable. Marcus read the message twice. Company counsel stood in his doorway, looking like she wished the email had said anything else. "She's tying cooperation to the public statements," counsel said. Marcus shook his head. "No, Darian tied them together when he started attacking the person we need." That was the first time he said it that plainly. The company had wanted Marisol to keep acting like a wife behind the scenes, while Darian treated her like a problem in public. Evelyn had just told them no, not loudly. Not emotionally. Just no, in writing, where nobody could pretend they had misunderstood. Marcus took the email to Darian himself. Darian was behind his desk. Already annoyed, already prepared to be bored by facts that didn't flatter him. Marcus placed the printed message in front of him. Several project promises depend on grant-side cooperation. Evelyn's saying there won't be any informal help while Marisol is being misrepresented publicly. Darian read the first few lines. For half a second, his face went still. It was quick. Most people would have missed it. Marcus didn't. Then Darian removed his glasses and started polishing one lens with his pocket square. "She's enjoying this," he said. Marcus didn't respond. Darian looked up. People finally know her name, and now she wants to turn that into leverage. Company counsel shifted beside Marcus. "That isn't what the letter says." Darian's eyes cut to her. "I know what it says." "No," Marcus said carefully. "I don't think you do." The room tightened. Darian smiled without warmth. "Let's not pretend Marisol suddenly became a business operator because she's upset about a separation." There it was again, the refusal. The need to make her small before the truth could make him feel dependent. Marcus glanced at the paper between them. Darian had felt the threat. He had seen the edge of it. And then he chose contempt because contempt was easier than admitting he needed her. Darian ordered a workaround by the end of the meeting. Marcus didn't argue. He just had the team make the calls. Alternative logistics contacts. Different routes. Other delivery windows. New local permissions. Anyone who might help them move around the grant structure without saying out loud that they were trying to move around Marisol. The answers came back ugly. One contact could do it, but not on the current timeline. Another wanted rates so high procurement went quiet. A third said local approvals would take longer than Darian's opening schedule allowed. By late afternoon, operations had a list of options that weren't really options. Marcus stood at the conference table while the analysts walked him through it. So we can replace it, one analyst said, but not without blowing the delivery schedule. Procurement added, and not without suppliers asking why the old protections disappeared. Marcus looked at the cost estimates, then at the timeline. Darian had spoken about Marisol like she was a vendor account to close out. But vendors could be swapped. This was different. The Grant Foundation was woven into how the company kept its promises. Pull one thread, and the pretty surface started puckering in places Darian didn't even know to look. The executive meeting was closed door, no assistants, no investor language, no polished talking points. Marcus stood at the front with the files arranged in plain stacks. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't need to. The coastal refinance depends on grant access, he said. The expansion timeline depends on grant-side local relationships. Supplier timing on 3 properties is tied to protections that came through Marisol's side. And several guest opening promises assume none of those relationships change. The procurement lead looked down at the table. Operations kept rubbing a thumb against the edge of a folder. The communications director, who had been brought in late, frowned. You're saying this touches valuation? Marcus answered without looking at Darian. I'm saying it touches whether we can keep the promises we've already made. Darian sat at the head of the table, silent in a way that made everyone more careful. Company counsel added, and we cannot keep treating requests to Marisol's side like routine housekeeping. The word housekeeping landed badly. Everybody heard the echo of Darian's old phrase, even though nobody repeated it. For years, the room had accepted his version because it was profitable to accept it. Now the numbers were forcing them to look at the woman he had dismissed and understand she was not beside the business. She was under it. The communications director was the first person brave enough to say the public part out loud. If we keep pushing the line that Marisol is difficult over money, it could backfire. Darian turned toward her slowly. Backfire how? She kept her hands folded on the table. Because anyone who sees these documents will know she controls things we need. Simon's posts, the captions, the planted language about bitterness. It all starts looking reckless if lenders or partners connect the dots. Darian's expression hardened. So now we're managing captions? We're managing credibility, she said. That quieted the room for a second. Marcus watched Darian's jaw move. He was grinding his teeth. Just slightly, the communications director went on. If we need her cooperation. Attacking her publicly makes us look either careless or dishonest. Darian gave a short laugh. She is making this difficult. Company counsel looked at the papers. The documents make it difficult. No one smiled. The insults that had worked so well at galas and in captions were turning dangerous in rooms where people asked for proof. Calling Marisol bitter had been useful when everyone thought she was powerless. Now it made Darian look reckless for attacking the person his company still needed. Darian listened to the warning, let the room sit with it for half a breath, and then dismissed it like a bad suggestion from someone who didn't understand power. No, he said. We are not shrinking from our own story because Marisol found herself a lawyer with a fountain pen. The communications director looked down at her notes. Marcus didn't. Darian turned to his assistant. Move the investor breakfast up. Full presentation. Press-friendly room. Clean visuals. I want Simone there. His assistant nodded quickly. Beside you? Of course beside me. Across the table, Marcus's face stayed flat, but the meaning was plain enough. The company had just spent hours tracing its risk back to Marisol. And Darian's answer was to put another woman in a nicer dress under better lighting. Simone took the call later that afternoon from a boutique showroom, already angling her face toward a mirrored wall while Darian explained the event. So stability, she said, future, forward motion. Exactly. Darian said, no mess, no old confusion. Old confusion. That was what he called the woman whose family's rights were holding his projects in place. By the end of the day, the breakfast had a guest list. A photographer, a soft gold color palette, and a message about strength through transition. Maricel's lawyers were pushed into the language of nuisance and delay. Darian had chosen his weapon again. Not truth. Performance. Marcus stayed late preparing the investor backup materials. The office thinned out around him. Lights clicked off down the hall. Somewhere near reception, the cleaning crew rolled a cart over the marble floor. He kept opening files. That was where the story got worse. The supplier guarantees Darian had bragged about in interviews had not appeared because he was brilliant at pressure. They traced back to conversations Maricel had held quietly years earlier, with people who trusted the Grant name. The credit protections investors praised as Darian's discipline had roots in trust side negotiations he had barely mentioned, if he mentioned them at all. Marcus scrolled through an old memo and found Maricel's initials in the margin, beside a note about keeping local partners protected if the project expanded too fast. He sat there for a long moment. He had presented Darian's stability story for years. Clean slides, confident numbers, language about leadership and execution. And beneath so much of it was a woman the company had learned not to name. A finance analyst appeared at the doorway. "You want me to soften that section for the deck?" Marcus looked at the screen. There it was, the choice trying to dress itself up as professionalism. He didn't answer right away. Because if he softened it, he would be doing exactly what Darian had done. Taking Maricel's foundation and hiding it under another man's shine. Marcus stayed late with two versions of the same note open on his screen. The first one sounded careful. It used phrases like unresolved access questions and partner sensitivities. It did what executives liked risk notes to do. It told the truth sideways, softly enough that nobody had to feel accused. The second version was shorter. Maricel Grant's side controlled key protections the company could not replace quickly. Marcus stared at that sentence for a long time. He could already hear Darian calling it disloyal. He could imagine the look, the quiet punishment, the way Darian would make it seem like Marcus had panicked over a domestic matter. But he could also imagine the lender calls if he buried it. The questions, the records. The moment somebody asked why the CFO had known and still let Darian sell certainty. He rubbed both hands over his face, then reached for his phone and opened the market app out of habit. Numbers moved across the screen. None of them helped him. Neutrality had always been Marcus's favorite hiding place. Not taking sides. Just protecting the balance sheet. Just being professional. But that night, the documents left him with no clean place to stand. If he softened Maricel's authority, he wasn't staying neutral. He was helping Darian lie. The next morning, Marcus brought the clearer note to a smaller group. Company counsel read it first, then operations, then procurement. Finance already knew enough to look uncomfortable before anyone spoke. Marcus didn't dress it up. "I need each department to confirm whether this is accurate." For a moment, nobody wanted to be first. Then operations pointed to the coastal project. That one needs Grant land access. Without it, the route changes and the schedule slips. Procurement added, the supplier protection on the hotel kitchens came through that side too. We can source elsewhere but not at the same timing or price. Finance tapped another line. This credit comfort everyone keeps praising? It's tied to trust side assurances. It was never just company strength. Company counsel, quieter than the rest, said, and the civic relationship for the expansion approvals traces back to the Grant family. Not Darian. The room went still after that. Not because the facts were complicated. Because they were simple. Land, supplies, credit, community access. 4 separate pieces of the empire. And every one of them pointed back toward Maricel in some way Darian had trained people not to mention. Marcus looked around the table and saw it settle over them. They didn't have one witness anymore. They had a room full of people who knew. Marcus waited until Darian was seated before he spoke. No one brought coffee into that meeting. No one made small talk. The files were already on the table. And the people who had confirmed them sat along both sides like they wished they could disappear into the chairs. Darian looked at Marcus. So? Marcus placed the risk note in front of him. This is broader than the refinance. Darian didn't pick it up. Meaning? Meaning internal teams can trace major operational and financial dependencies back to Maricel and the Grant Trust. Marcus kept his voice even. Land access. supplier protections, credit support, civic relationships. They're not side issues. Darian's mouth tightened. Choose your words carefully. I am. The room held its breath. Marcus continued, treating Maricel as irrelevant has become a survival problem for Vale Urban Resorts. There it was, not whispered in a hallway. Not hidden in a legal memo. Said in Darian's own company in front of the people responsible for keeping his promises alive. Company counsel looked down, but she didn't correct Marcus. Operations didn't either. Procurement sat frozen, hands clasped tight. Darian finally glanced at the papers. And for once, the title on his door didn't help him. The woman he had called the household side was now the business fact nobody in the room could afford to ignore. Darian left that meeting with his face calm and his pride bleeding underneath. By the time he reached his office, calm had turned into command. The breakfast proceeds, he told communications. No changes. The director hesitated. After what Marcus just no changes, Darian repeated. The message is simple. Personal distractions will not slow the company. Personal distractions. That was what he called the collapse of his own story. Within an hour, Simone was in a new campaign image. Standing beside Darian on a terrace with the city behind them. Her hand resting lightly on his arm. The caption drafts talked about focus, renewal, and steady leadership. Inside the company, people read the drafts while sitting on files that said Maricel's authorities still mattered more than the photograph. Marcus watched the image appear on the internal preview screen and said nothing. The communications director didn't either. They both understood the split now. Investors would see polish. Simone would see her place beside him. Darian would see control. But beneath all that gloss, the company still needed the woman he had tried to make invisible. And instead of correcting the insult, Darian was preparing to repeat it with better lighting and more witnesses. The investor breakfast looked expensive enough to make doubt feel rude. White tablecloths, low flowers, warm lights. A skyline view arranged behind Darian like it had been built for him personally. Simone stood near his shoulder in cream silk, smiling at guests as if she had always belonged in rooms where money waited to be reassured. Darian moved easily from table to table. Good to see you. Strong quarter ahead. Nothing but forward motion. When he finally spoke to the room, his voice carried that practiced warmth people mistook for honesty. Transitions happen in life, he said. But Vale Urban Resorts is steady, focused, built for the future. Simone smiled at the word future. Marcus sat 2 seats down with a folder closed in front of him. Inside were the risk notes Darian did not want discussed. Grant access unresolved. Supplier protections unsettled. Credit comfort dependent on Maricel's side. The investors saw Darian's suit, Simone's poise, the projection screen full of beautiful properties and confident dates. Marcus saw the missing confirmations under every promise. Darian lifted his glass of water and gave the room a polished nod. To stability, he said. A few people applauded. Marcus did not. The first real question came after the applause had thinned. A lead lender pulled Marcus aside near the coffee service. Away from Darian's smile and Simone's polished quiet. We'll need written comfort on the coastal expansion, the lender said. And on the credit protections attached to it. Marcus held the man's gaze for a second too long. Behind them, Darian was still working the room, one hand in his pocket. Laughing softly with investors like every promise he had just made was already secured. But Marcus knew what the lender was asking for. He wasn't asking for charm. He wasn't asking for another slide deck or another quote about legacy. He wanted something in writing. And Marcus could not give it to him without pointing toward Maricel. I'll have to confirm a few items before I send anything over, Marcus said. The lender's expression changed just enough. With Darian? Marcus glanced across the room, where Darian was nodding through another conversation as if the whole building still moved on his word. No, Marcus said carefully. Not only with Darian. The lender understood more than Marcus had said. For the first time, outside money stopped taking Darian's confidence as proof. It began looking for the person whose name he had tried to keep out of the room. Marcus brought the lender's request to Darian before the room had fully cleared. Darian's smile faded only after the last investor stepped out of earshot. She wants written comfort? He asked. Yes, Marcus said. And she knows the confirmation sits with Maricel's side. Darian looked toward the windows, then back at Marcus. Then reassure her. With what? With the truth that Mrs. Vale is not going to obstruct family business because she's upset. The communications director lowered her eyes. Company counsel went very still. Darian removed his glasses and polished one lens with slow, irritated care. Let's be adult about optics. Maricel is trying to embarrass me because Simone is visible. That's all. Marcus let the sentence hang. Then he said, a lender isn't asking about Simone. Darian's eyes sharpened. Don't get cute. She's asking who can stand behind the rights we just promised. For a second, Darian looked less angry than trapped. Then the anger came back because it was easier. Get Evelyn on the line, he said. Make it happen. But that was the problem. His staff could make calls. They could draft language. They could manage rooms. They could not turn Darian's contempt into proof. And they could not make Maricel's authority disappear, just because he still wanted to call her his wife when he needed something. Evelyn's statement arrived without drama. No heat, no pleading, no performance. Just a clear answer sent to Marcus and copied where the lender could see it. Maricel would not support any project, credit protection, or access promise, while Darian's team misstated her standing. Grant-held rights were not his private convenience. They could not be waved through because he needed lenders calm by lunch. Marcus read it in his office with the door half closed. The lender read it somewhere else, probably in a room just as quiet. Maricel sat across from Evelyn when the message went out. Hands folded around a cup of tea she had barely touched. They'll call it obstruction, Maricel said. Evelyn capped her pen. Some will. Until they need the truth more than they need his comfort. Maricel looked toward the window. She had spent months being called graceful when they meant silent. Difficult when she refused to disappear, emotional when she protected what she was responsible for. Now her answer had reached people Darian could not charm. Not as an outburst, as a boundary. And the lender had to treat it like one. The supplier call came through procurement before the afternoon was over. The voice on the other end was polite, but the message was not soft. Preferred delivery terms for the hotel kitchens would pause until the grant-linked protections were confirmed. Existing promises would be honored, but expanded terms needed assurance from Maricel's side. The procurement lead sat back like the chair had shifted beneath him. We've worked together for years, he said. That relationship has always been protected through the grant side. The supplier answered. If that's disputed now, we need to know who stands behind it. There it was again. Who, not what Darian had announced. Not what the company preferred to believe. Who stood behind it? Operations was pulled in next. Then Marcus. Suddenly this wasn't a line in a risk note. It was delivery schedules, kitchen openings, staff waiting on equipment, rooms promised to guests before the company could prove the foundation under them still held. Darian had treated those relationships like background furniture in the empire he decorated with his own name. But the supplier knew better. The trust was not wallpaper. And Maricel was not optional. Operations tried the coastal contacts next. They expected practical answers. Dates, permits, routing, maybe a little local frustration. What they got was memory. A civic contact on the coast listened to the request, then said, those access agreements were built through the Grant family. Through church people, school people. Folks who trusted Miss Lenora and Maricel's grandmother before anybody knew Darian Vale's name. The operations manager went quiet. The contact continued, not angry. Just firm. Nobody down here is smoothing his timeline while he lets that woman be called bitter in public. When Marcus heard the report, he didn't ask for the sentence to be softened. There was no soft version of it. Darian's magazine profiles meant little to people who remembered whose land had stayed protected, whose promises had been kept, whose elders had sat in church basements and community meetings long before luxury brochures showed up. The Grant name carried weight Darian had enjoyed without understanding. And now the people attached to that name were making a simple thing plain. You did not insult the steward and keep walking through the gate. Lenora found Maricel at the kitchen table, the red ledger open beside a stack of papers. She didn't sit right away. She went to the sink, rinsed a cup that was already clean, dried it with a dish towel, then turned around. Now hear me with both ears, she said. Maricel looked up, Lenora's voice was gentle, but it had iron in it. There was a time when staying quiet kept the gossip smaller. I know that, your grandmother knew that. Black women didn't get the luxury of falling apart in public and being called complicated in a pretty way. Marisol closed the ledger halfway. But this? Lenora said. This is different. If your silence lets that man damage what Grant women protected, then silence isn't dignity anymore. It's a door he's using. Marisol looked down at her hands. I don't want it to look like I'm trying to punish him. Lenora came closer and adjusted the edge of the paper nearest her. Something practical for her hands to do while the truth sat heavy between them. Baby, telling the truth with documents is not punishment. It's stewardship. Marisol breathed in slowly. For the first time, visibility did not feel only like exposure. It felt like responsibility. Evelyn prepared the notice after Marisol gave the word. She did not make it dramatic. Marisol would not have allowed that anyway. The language was restrained. Almost plain enough to disappoint anyone looking for a fight. Grant-controlled rights and protections remained under Marisol Grant's stewardship. Darien Vale and Vale Urban Resorts could not promise them, trade on them, or imply approval without written confirmation from her side. Evelyn read the final version aloud. Marisol listened without interrupting. When Evelyn finished, she asked, Are you ready for them to know? Marisol's eyes moved to the red leather ledger on the desk. She thought of every phrase written there. Mrs. Vale, household side. Previous chapter. Bitter. Difficult. Emotional. All those names other people had tried to put on her because the right one made them uncomfortable. Yes, she said. The notice went to lenders. To key suppliers. To development contacts who had been waiting to see which way the truth would move. And once it left Evelyn's office, Darien's title stopped being enough. Outside partners no longer had to guess who could approve what. They had her name. The follow-up session was supposed to be the easy part. Darien had investors gathered around smaller tables now, nodding through questions about timelines and expansion dates. Simone stood beside him with that practiced, camera-ready smile, the kind that made every room feel like a brand shoot. Then his assistant came in too fast. She tried to catch his eye quietly, but the room saw her before he did. Darien kept smiling. Give me 1 second. She leaned close. The lead lender is asking whether Marisol Grant has approved the coastal access language. His smile held, but his eyes changed. Before he could answer, her phone buzzed again. And procurement says the supplier wants confirmation from Marisol's office before extending the new terms. Marcus looked down at the table. The assistant swallowed. There's also a call from the coastal development contact. They're asking the same thing. For a moment, all the expensive confidence in the room had nowhere to stand. An investor glanced from Darien to Marcus. Another looked at Simone. Simone's smile thinned. Not because she understood every document, but because she understood attention. And right then, attention had shifted away from her cream silk and Darien's polished speech. It had moved to a woman who wasn't even in the room. Marisol Grant. Her name passed from lender to supplier to coastal contact like a key nobody could open the door without. Darien straightened his jacket. We'll handle it. But the words sounded smaller than they had an hour before. Darien tried to recover the room the only way he knew how. He made Marisol sound small. This is part of the emotional side of separation, he said, voice warm enough to pass for patience. Marisol is reacting to a difficult transition. Once council finishes, things will settle. The sentence might have worked a month earlier. It might have worked at a gala, with champagne in people's hands and Simone smiling beside him, like proof that his version of the story was the prettier one. But this room had heard too much. The lead lender set his cup down, not loudly. Just enough for the porcelain to touch the saucer and make people look. Help me understand something, he said. If this is just an emotional spouse reacting to a separation, why does she control the land access, the supplier protections, and the credit comfort you represented as company strength? No one jumped in. Darien's face did not change much, but the silence around him did. Marcus watched the question land where all the polite warnings had not. Company counsel looked at the table. Simone's eyes moved from the lender to Darien, searching his face for the answer he usually had ready. This time the old explanation didn't fit. because the documents had made Marisol too real to misname. And Darian's favorite story, the bitter wife making trouble, suddenly sounded like exactly what it was. A man trying to insult the woman whose signature his empire needed. The lender did not let Darian's answer sit unchallenged. "If this is only a personal dispute," she said, "why are so many commitments waiting on Mrs. Grant?" Darian's jaw tightened at the name. Marcus could have stayed quiet. A few months earlier, he probably would have. He would have found a careful phrase. Something soft enough to protect the room from the truth. This time he closed the folder in front of him. "It isn't one angry spouse," Marcus said. Darian turned his head slowly. Marcus kept going. "And it isn't one delayed contract. The lender questions, the supplier terms, the coastal access, the civic relationships, the development promises, they all trace back to Grant-controlled protections." The room went still. Simone looked at Darian, but he didn't look back. Marcus's voice stayed even. "Marisol Grant is the person withstanding to approve or withhold them." No one coughed, no one moved a chair. Even the assistant near the wall stopped pretending to type. Darian had built the morning to prove he was independent. Steady, fully in command. He had brought Simone in as the living picture of his future. And now, in front of investors, counsel, lenders, and the woman he had used to replace his wife in public, the room had to face the plain thing beneath all his shine. The empire didn't answer all the way up to him. It answered, in all the places that mattered, to Marisol. The meeting did not end cleanly. People stood in small clusters instead of leaving with easy handshakes. Investors spoke lower than they had when they arrived. The lead lender pulled Marcus aside and said she wanted a direct call with Evelyn Price and Marisol. Not another assurance filtered through Darian's office. Across the room, the procurement lead read a message from the supplier and went pale. Expanded terms were paused until Marisol's side responded. Darian watched it all happen with a face that looked calm from a distance and furious up close. Simone stood near the windows, scrolling without reading, her polished composure starting to look like something she had to hold in place with both hands. The communications director approached Darian carefully. "We need to adjust the statement." "No," Darian said. "Darian, the people in this room heard Marcus." He looked at her like the warning offended him. "The statement says delays are tied to divorce bitterness. Keep it simple." Marcus heard it from a few feet away and almost laughed. But there was nothing funny in it. Darian was still trying to shame the woman everyone had just learned he needed. The practical world had already moved on. Lenders wanted Evelyn. Suppliers wanted Marisol's office. Development contacts wanted the grant steward. Darian still had a communications team. He still had a title. He still had Simone standing nearby in the image he had chosen. But the people who protected money, delivery, and access were no longer waiting for his performance. They were going around him. By the end of the week, the whispers had crossed out of business rooms and into the charity circuit. At a philanthropy board reception, women in soft jackets and men with donor pins spoke over small plates and lowered their voices when Darian's name came up. Tessa Whitcomb heard it near the bar first. The lender asked for Marisol Grant directly. Then again near the coat room. A supplier won't expand terms without her office. Then from a board member who had once laughed warmly at Darian's jokes and called Simone refreshing. Apparently the Grant side has more authority than anyone understood. Tessa lifted her champagne flute but didn't drink. She remembered her own words. Graciously low profile. Such a polished way to make a woman sound small. Such a useful phrase when Darian's version had been the easier one to print. Now the same name Tessa had softened in the background was being spoken with caution. Marisol Grant was no longer just the quiet separated wife people could mention with a sympathetic tilt of the head. She was becoming the person other people had to check with. That changed the temperature in the room. Darian had once made access feel safe. Being near him meant being near the future. Now, being too close to his story meant risking embarrassment when the facts caught up. Tessa went home and opened a blank draft before she took off her earrings. The first sentence came too easily. Marisol Grant, long known as graciously low profile, has emerged as a surprisingly formidable presence behind several veil-adjacent civic and development conversations. Tessa stared at it. Surprisingly formidable. It sounded like praise if you didn't listen too closely. It also let Tessa pretend Maricel had changed, instead of admitting the rune had been wrong about her from the beginning. She deleted long known and tried again. The grant name, often understated in Atlanta's philanthropic circles, may carry more influence than previously understood. Previously understood by whom she did not say. She added a line about Darian's transition. Another about Simone's visible role, then cut Simone's name back down to a passing mention. The story was shifting, and Tessa knew better than to keep decorating the wrong person. Still, every sentence tried to save her own face. She wanted to sound early, discerning, almost generous. Not like a woman who had lifted a champagne flute over Maricel's humiliation and called it grace. When the draft finally sat in front of her, Tessa leaned back. Maricel was no longer safe to ignore. But even in recognition, Tessa could not quite stop making the truth sound like a discovery she had personally made. Darian's communications director brought the revised social chatter to him with the caution of someone carrying a glass too full. He read Tessa's draft on a tablet, expression flat. Surprisingly formidable. He said. Marcus stood near the wall. He had been asked to stay because nobody could discuss the story anymore without finance sitting in the corner like an unpaid conscience. The communications director said, "This is why we need to stop using bitterness as the explanation." Darian looked up. Excuse me? Board members are talking to lenders. Suppliers are talking to procurement. People can connect the delays to grant-controlled authority now. If we keep saying Maricel is emotional, it makes us look like we're either lying or we don't understand our own dependencies. Darian set the tablet down very carefully. You want me to validate her? I want us not to create a bigger credibility problem. He gave a quiet, humorless smile. That sounds like the same thing. No, Marcus said. It sounds like the facts caught up. Darian's eyes went to him, cold and sharp. The old story had worked when people were willing to see Maricel as a disappointed wife. It started failing the moment records and phone calls made her authority visible. Calling her bitter no longer boxed her in. It boxed Darian in with his own words. At the charity planning lunch, Simone arrived like she expected the room to make space for her. She had the lighting checked before she sat down, angling her chair just enough to catch the soft glow from the windows. Her blouse was pale blue, her earrings small but expensive. Her smile practiced in that effortless way that took a lot of effort. For the first few minutes, it worked. Board members greeted her warmly. Someone asked about Darian's investor breakfast. Someone else mentioned how fresh the rebrand felt. Simone laughed lightly and placed one hand near her collarbone. Darian is focused on the next chapter. I think everyone can feel that. It's about alignment now. The right people, the right vision, the right energy. A month earlier, that sentence would have floated over the table and landed exactly where she wanted it to land. This time, one of the older board members looked down at her notes. Speaking of alignment, the woman said, should Maricel Grant be included in the coastal development briefing? Simone's smile stayed up, but it lost its warmth. Tessa, seated 2 chairs away, lifted one eyebrow over her iced tea and said nothing. Another board member nodded. If the grant relationships are central, it seems strange to discuss community access without her. The table shifted around Simone, without anyone moving. No one insulted her. No one raised a voice. That almost made it worse. They simply stopped treating her as the future and started asking for the woman she had called a previous chapter. Simone reached for her glass, buying herself a second. I'm sure Darian's office can advise on the appropriate participants, she said. But even as she said it, she heard how thin it sounded. Darian's office was no longer the answer to every question. And Maricel's name had entered the room with more weight than Simone's presence could push aside. The invitation came through Evelyn's office the next morning. A formal letter from the philanthropy board connected to the coastal project. Clean letterhead. Careful language. No gossip, no apology, no mention of Darian's embarrassment. Evelyn read it once, then passed it across the desk. Maricel took her time. The board was requesting her attendance at an upcoming briefing in her capacity as steward of the Grant Family Trust. Not Mrs. Vale, not Darian's separated wife, not the graceful woman expected to fade from the room. Maricel Grant. Evelyn watched her read the line again. They want the person with standing present, Evelyn said. Maricel folded the letter along its original crease. And if I go, half of them will say I'm trying to embarrass him. Some already said less with more confidence. That almost pulled a smile from her, but not quite. Maricel looked at the letter in her hands. It was just an invitation, but it carried the weight of a door opening in public. A door Darian had never meant for her to walk through under her own name. If she accepted, she would no longer be represented only through calls, notices and whispers. She would have to sit in the room as the authority he tried to hide. And she would have to decide whether visibility was spectacle or the next necessary act of stewardship. Maricel stood in Evelyn's office with the board invitation on the desk between them. Lenara sat nearby, her purse still on her lap, watching Maricel the way only family can watch you when they already know what you're afraid to say. Maricel touched the edge of the paper. I don't want to walk into that room and look like I'm parading power. Evelyn's violet pen paused above her notes. Maricel kept her eyes on the invitation. You know what they'll say? That I waited until he was exposed. That I'm punishing him. That I'm bitter because he chose Simone. Lenora gave a low sound, not quite a laugh. Now hear me with both ears, she said. People who want you small will call you bitter whether you whisper or shout. Maricel looked at her. Lenora leaned forward. Your grandmother taught you privacy. She did not teach you to hide the truth so a man could stay comfortable in a lie. The room went quiet. Evelyn set her pen down. This briefing is not a performance. It is a record. If you're not in the room, Darian's version keeps breathing. Maricel pressed her lips together. For years, she had believed restraint meant not giving people a show. Not letting society turn family business into entertainment. Not letting a black woman's rightful anger become somebody else's proof that she was unstable. But this was no longer just about being watched. It was about what would be protected if she stayed absent. And what would be protected if she appeared. Lenora's voice softened. Baby, dignity is not disappearing. Maricel picked up the invitation. All right, she said quietly. Tell them I'll attend. Maricel arrived without spectacle, no entourage, no flash, no attempt to match the room's hunger for drama. She wore a simple dark suit, pearl studs, and the calm face people had mistaken for surrender too many times. The red leather ledger was tucked inside her bag, close enough for her to feel its shape when she rested her hand there. Evelyn walked beside her. Lenora followed just behind, chin lifted. Eyes taking in the room like she was memorizing who looked surprised. Tessa was already seated near the side wall. Marcus sat with a folder in front of him. Board members shifted as Maricel entered, not with the careless politeness she had received at the gala, but with a new caution. Then Darian came in. He looked at Maricel once. Quickly, as if he expected the room to remember she was supposed to be difficult. Emotional managed. Before he could speak, the board chair stood. Thank you all for being here. We're grateful to have Maricel Grant with us today. Steward of the Grant Family Trust. The words landed cleanly. Not Mrs. Vale, not Darian's separated wife. Not the household side. Maricel Grant, steward. A few people turned toward Darian almost involuntarily. His face held its shape, but his eyes hardened. Maricel took her seat without looking for his approval. For the first time in a room like that, Darian did not get to introduce her. Define her, soften her, or shrink her into a title that served him. She was there under her own name. And everyone heard it. Darian let the chair finish, then leaned back like he was allowing the room a courtesy. I appreciate everyone's attention to process, he said. But let's not lose sight of the larger picture. Maricel watched him reach for his glasses. There it was. He removed them slowly, polished one lens with his pocket square, and gave the room the controlled half-smile that had once made people sit up straighter. Let's be adult about optics, he began. The board chair cut in before he could build the sentence into a wall. Mr. Vale, this meeting is not about optics. Darian's hand stopped. The chair continued, calm and direct. It is about who has the authority to approve rights and protections your company has been publicly promising. No one rushed to rescue him from the silence. Tessa looked down at her notes. Marcus kept his eyes forward. Evelyn did not move at all. Darian put his glasses back on. I'm not sure that distinction helps the room. It helps the record. The chair said. Maricel felt Lenora shift beside her. Just a fraction, the smallest sign of satisfaction. For years, Darian had used that kind of language to make cruelty sound clean. Optics, maturity, calm adults. He had wrapped disrespect in strategy until rooms accepted it as leadership. But this room had documents now, witnesses, calls from lenders, suppliers asking for the right person, civic contacts refusing to pretend. His favorite phrase had nowhere to go. The conversation did not bend around him. It moved past him, toward the authority he had tried to dismiss. Once Darian's framing failed, the room turned to evidence. Marcus spoke first. He did not over-explain. He did not hide behind soft phrases. Our records show the coastal expansion depends on grant land access, he said. Without that access, the timeline Darian presented cannot hold as stated. A lender representative followed, opening a folder marked with neat tabs. Our comfort with the credit side was tied to protections we now understand are connected to Mrs. Grant's stewardship. We need her side's confirmation before we can treat those promises as stable. Darian's jaw worked once, but he said nothing. Then the coastal civic contact, an older man with a steady voice, looked around the table. Community trust down there was not built by brochures, he said. It came through Grant family relationships, church people, local elders, folks who believed Maricel would keep faith with what her family promised. Maricel sat still, hands folded in her lap. She did not have to defend herself. She did not have to list what she had done, or prove she had not imagined her own importance, or explain why being quiet had never meant being empty. Other people were saying it now. Finance, community, lenders, the company's own records. Each voice placed another piece of the foundation on the table. Darian had told the world he built alone. The room was learning how much of that story had been standing on Maricel's ground. By the time the briefing ended, the language in the room had changed. It happened in small ways first. A board member asked, "Does Maricel Grant's office need the revised packet?" Another said, "We should wait for Ms. Grant's position before setting the next date." No one looked to Darian to correct them. Tessa heard every shift. She stepped into the hallway after the meeting and opened her phone, her thumb hovering over the draft she had been shaping for 2 days. The old phrasing looked embarrassing now. Graciously low profile. Surprisingly formidable. Careful little compliments that still made Maricel sound like a discovery made by people who had not bothered to look. Tessa changed the sentence. Maricel Grant, principal steward of the Grant Family Trust, holds authority beneath several Vale urban resorts projects now under review. She stared at it. It was less pretty, more accurate. Inside the briefing room, Darian was speaking in a low voice with company counsel. But fewer eyes followed him than before. People were looking for Evelyn, for Marcus, for the board chair, for Maricel. The social world did not become noble in an afternoon. It was still protecting itself, still adjusting because the truth had become too risky to ignore. But the old labels were losing their grip. The title Darian had used to contain her was falling away. And in its place people were beginning to say her full name. The business press did not treat the briefing like gossip. That was what made it worse for Darian. By morning, the headline was clean, careful, and impossible to dismiss. Vale Urban Resorts faced questions about project stability after documents and board testimony showed key developments depended on grant-controlled land access, supplier protections, credit comfort, and civic relationships stewarded by Maricel Grant. Not Mrs. Vale, Maricel Grant. Darian stood in his office with the article open on the glass table. The city behind him looking exactly as expensive as it had the day before. But the room felt different now. His phone kept lighting up. An investor asking whether the reporting was accurate. A board member requesting updated language. A media booker quietly postponing a profile that had been built around his self-made rise. He read the paragraph that named Marcus as a company source on dependency risk. He read the sentence that cited Tessa's revised column. He read, twice, the line that said Vale's public story had understated the Grant Trust's role. Understated was the polite word, and Darian knew it. For years, Darian had been praised as the architect, the visionary, the man who took neglected properties and made them gleam. He had accepted every award, every magazine cover, Every panel invitation about ownership and legacy, as if no one else's foundation had been beneath his feet. Now the same systems that had polished him were revising him in public. No one had leaked a messy private story. Maricel had not begged for sympathy. The evidence had simply become too heavy for his myth to hold. In elite circles, people who once repeated his version began speaking more carefully. Investors stopped asking how quickly he could move and started asking who had the right to approve. Business observers stopped calling the divorce a personal distraction and started calling Maricel's authority a central fact. Darian picked up his glasses, then put them down without polishing them. There was no phrase smooth enough for this. The world he had used to make Maricel look small was now learning that his greatness had been standing on ground she stewarded. And this time, he could not make the correction stay inside a room. Darian called Maricel after 9 that night. She let the phone ring once, twice, 3 times before answering. For a moment, he said nothing. Then she heard him breathe out, Maricel, not Mrs. Vale, not the household side. Her name, finally, because he needed something. Yes? His voice was lower than usual, stripped of the shine he used in rooms. This has gone too far. She stood near the kitchen window of the Grant house, looking out at the dark yard. What has? The story. The lender calls. The board. They're making this look like I misled people. Maricel closed her eyes for 1 second. You did. A pause. I'm trying to correct it without damaging everyone. No, she said. You're trying to correct it without damaging yourself. His voice tightened. We can put out a joint statement. Calm lenders. Say we're aligned on continuity. You don't have to make this uglier than it is. There it was again. The old request in new clothes. Stand beside me. Soften this. Make my choices survivable. Maricel opened her eyes. All requests go through Evelyn. Maricel, don't do that. I'm not standing beside you to soften consequences you created. He went quiet, and in that silence, she could feel what he was finally beginning to understand. He had lost more than a wife he thought he could replace. He had lost access to her judgment, her restraint, her name, and the foundation he had mistaken for background. When he spoke again, the panic was closer to the surface. I need you to help me fix this. No, Maricel said. You need me to make it look like you didn't break it. Then she ended the call. No raised voice. No final speech. No door left cracked open for him to walk through later. Darian was left with the dead line in his hand and the public story turning without her protection. Darian did not call Maricel again, not directly. By then, even he understood that the old route was closed. Instead, he had counsel reach Evelyn with language that sounded urgent, but tried to look reasonable. A joint statement, temporary confirmations. Something to calm lenders while everyone worked through misunderstandings. Evelyn read the request once, drew a line beside the word temporary in violet ink, and called Darian's lawyer with Maricel sitting across from her. No, Evelyn said. There was a pause on the other end. The lawyer tried again. Mr. Vale is asking for a limited cooperation framework. No admission, no prejudice. Just enough to stabilize the situation. Evelyn's eyes stayed on the page. Maricel will not lend her name, her silence, or her trust authority to repair a public lie. Another pause. This could affect lenders. It already has. Evelyn, we're trying to avoid unnecessary damage. Then your client should have avoided unnecessary damage. Maricel did not smile. She did not need to. Across town, Darian stood beside his conference table while his attorney relayed the answer. His face hardened in stages, like every word arrived late and unwelcome. She won't even issue a neutral statement? He asked. No. What about confirmations already relied on? Through proper channels only. Reviewed separately. No joint language. Darian looked toward the windows. But the skyline gave him nothing back. For years, Maricel's restraint had functioned like a cushion under him. She corrected quietly, protected quietly, absorbed more than he ever admitted. Because family business stayed private and dignity did not chase applause. Now he needed that old quiet more than ever. And for the first time, it was not available. Recognition had come too late to restore access. He could need her. He could regret the timing. He could fear what lenders would do next. But he could not compel the woman he had humiliated to become his emergency cover. Once Evelyn refused the joint statement, the calls stopped circling Darian's office and began landing where they should have landed all along. A formal review was scheduled with Marisol, Evelyn, lender representatives, supplier council, the philanthropy board, and Marcus. Darian was not listed as the person who would confirm future commitments. That detail moved through Vale Urban Resorts like a quiet alarm. In the conference room, the seating alone told the story. Marisol sat beside Evelyn, with Lenora just behind her. Lenders placed their folders in front of Marisol, not Marcus. Supplier representatives directed questions to Evelyn first, then waited for Marisol's answer. Board members who had once sent invitations through Darian's people now addressed her without using his name as a bridge. Marcus sat across the table, tired around the eyes, tapping nothing into his phone for once. A lender representative opened the meeting. For clarity going forward, any commitment tied to grant-controlled protections will require confirmation from immersive. Grant side, Marisol gave one small nod. That's correct. The supplier representative added, we'll also need to separate existing obligations from any expanded terms Vale may have announced. We can review those, Evelyn said. But no one should assume approval because Darian made a public statement. No one argued. That was the difference. A year earlier, people would have looked to Darian's office to make the call. A month earlier, they would have asked whether Marisol was being difficult. Now the room had rearranged itself around the practical truth. The person whose judgment mattered was sitting in front of them. Marisol kept her voice even. She did not perform victory. She did not make anyone apologize before the work began. Still, every folder turned toward her was an answer to the night. They had made her stand in a gala room and watch her own erasure dressed up as elegance. The institutions had stopped waiting for Darian to translate her. They had come to her. When the first round of questions ended, Marisol placed both hands on the table. The room settled without anyone asking it to. I want something understood at the start, she said. The Grant Foundation will honor legitimate promises made to workers, communities, and partners where those promises can be honored responsibly. Marcus looked up. A supplier representative stopped writing. Marisol continued. People should not lose wages because Darian overstated what he controlled. Communities should not be left with broken commitments because Vale wanted a cleaner story. And partners who acted in good faith should not be punished for believing what they were told. Lenora watched her from the side, her face still, her eyes warm. But, Marisol said, and the word changed the room. We will not support any statement, project, or timetable that misnames my role. We will not pretend family rights are company assets. We will not let grant relationships be treated as marital leftovers Darian can keep using after publicly degrading the woman responsible for them. No one rushed in to soften it. Evelyn's pen rested untouched beside her notes. The lender representative asked, so continuity is possible, but not under the old assumptions? That's right, Marisol said. Continuity with truth. Not convenience with a lie. The answer was simple enough for every person in the room to understand. She was separating what deserved protection from what did not. Workers, communities, and promises made in good faith. Darian's image was not on that list. For so long people had treated her quiet as softness they could step on. Now they were seeing the shape of it clearly. It had always been discipline. And discipline, once it stopped hiding, had weight. Marcus updated the risk report that afternoon. He did it with the door closed, and the earlier version open beside it. The one full of careful phrases and soft edges, exposure, possible dependency, relationship sensitivity. He deleted most of that. The new language was plain. Vale Urban Resorts could not represent grant-controlled land access, supplier protections, credit comfort, or civic relationships as company-owned assets. Any public statement implying sole company control had to be withdrawn or corrected. When he presented it to the board representatives and company council, Darian sat at the far end of the table with his arms folded. This reads like capitulation, Darian said. Marcus did not look away. It reads like the file. Company counsel slid a marked copy toward Darian. We also need you to step back from language suggesting full control over the coastal expansion until Mrs. Grant's side confirms what can continue. Darian gave a short laugh. So now my own company is telling me how to describe my projects? A board representative answered before Marcus could. Your projects are the issue. They were described as if rights held by another party belonged to us. Another party. Even that was softer than saying her name. But everyone knew who they meant. Darian looked at the paper like it had betrayed him. For years, corporate decks had turned his version of reality into something with charts, photos, and clean language. They had made his confidence look like proof. They had taken things Maricel helped stabilize and placed them under the glow of his leadership. Now the same company record was pulling those claims back. Not out of generosity, out of necessity. The evidence no longer allowed the lie to stand. Darian could still sit at the head of a table. He could still object in that controlled voice. But he could not make the report call Maricel's foundation his property. The institution that had amplified his myth was correcting him in writing. The public correction arrived in pieces, then all at once. First came the business update, dry enough to sound harmless if a person did not know how much it cost Darian. Vale Urban Resorts clarified that several key projects depended on rights and protections stewarded through the Grant Family Trust, with Maricel Grant serving as the relevant authority for future confirmations. Then Tessa's column shifted again. This time she did not call Maricel low profile. She did not tuck her into a sentence about Darian's personal transition. She did not use surprisingly as a shield for her own late understanding. Maricel Grant was named as a Grant Trust steward and strategic foundation behind several Vale projects now under review. The word spread quickly because they corrected more than a business mistake. They corrected a social insult. The woman who had been reduced to Mrs. Vale was now named in her own right. The woman Darian had called the household side was now publicly tied to the land, protections, and judgment that helped hold the company steady. The woman Simone had captioned as a previous chapter was now written into the present tense of the Empire's survival. People noticed. Some pretended they had known all along. Some adjusted their tone with the smoothness of people who had practiced never being caught on the wrong side of power. But the old language no longer worked. It looked foolish now. Cheap. Small. Every corrected sentence made the original humiliation more visible. Not because Maricel asked anyone to replay it, but because the truth made the lie embarrassing. Darian lost something in that correction that money could not immediately replace. He lost the elegance of his betrayal. The story no longer made him look like a man gracefully moving forward. It made him look like a man who had tried to discard the woman holding up the ground beneath him. Simone removed the captions late at night. Not all at once. One post first, then another. The photo from the gala stayed up. But the sentence about previous chapters disappeared. So did the line about Elevation choosing its own company? By morning people had noticed. They always noticed when a woman edited herself after pretending she never would. In the comments, the tone had changed. Nobody was calling her Darian's perfect match anymore. Nobody was praising the new era with the same easy certainty. A few accounts asked why the captions were gone. Others posted clips from the business coverage and asked whether the upgrade narrative had aged badly. Simone sat at her vanity with her phone propped against a small mirror. The same mirror she used to check angles before interviews. The lighting was still flattering. Her face still looked beautiful on camera. But beauty did not answer the question sitting in her inbox. A luxury campaign tied to Darian's rebrand had been paused. The brand representative wrote politely, with all the careful warmth people use when they are already backing away. Given the recent developments, we're reassessing alignment. Simone read that word twice. Alignment. The same kind of word she had used to make Maricel sound outdated. Now it was being used to make Simone disposable. She called her manager. Can we push back? Simone asked. Her manager hesitated. We can ask for timing, but they don't want to be tied to that whole image push right now. That whole image push. You know what I mean. Simone did know. She had been useful when Darian needed a symbol. Younger, shinier, easier to photograph beside him than the wife he was trying to make look like yesterday's obligation. She had told herself that being chosen meant she had won something permanent. But the moment Maricel's authority became public, Simone's place looked different. Not like proof of Darian's elevated future. Like decoration on a lie. For the first time, she seemed to understand that helping a powerful man humiliate another woman had not made her secure. It had only tied her value to his failing story. And once that story started collapsing, his glamour could not protect hers. Darian's final board meeting before the expansion pause was shorter than he expected. That more than anything told him how much had changed. No long debate, no admiration dressed as concern. No one asking him to inspire the room back into confidence. The board representative read the decision from a prepared page. Public expansion announcements would be suspended. Lenders would reassess timelines based on the terms confirmed through Maricel's side. Any future presentation would need corrected language around grant-controlled rights and protections. Darian sat very still. When the representative finished, he leaned forward. This has been framed poorly. What we're dealing with is a misunderstanding during a difficult personal transition. No one answered right away. Marcus looked down at the report in front of him. Then back up. Company counsel adjusted a pen. One of the lender representatives folded her hands. The silence was not confusion, it was refusal. They were no longer helping him soften the facts. Darian tried again. Maricel and I had arrangements that worked for years. Marcus said, those arrangements were not ownership. The sentence sat in the room like a door closing. Darian's mouth tightened. I built this company. You built a public company story. The lender representative said, the review is about what that story depended on. No one said it cruelly. That might have been easier for him to fight. They said it like people protecting themselves from a man whose pride had become expensive. By the end of the meeting, Darian had not been stripped of every title. That was not the shape of the consequence. It was narrower and more humiliating. He could no longer stand in front of cameras and promise movement as if his word alone made the ground open. He could no longer treat Maricel's authority as a private inconvenience. He could no longer call dependence a misunderstanding and expect professionals to nod for the sake of his image. His power had not vanished. It had been measured, limited, corrected. And outside that room, Maricel's confirmed terms now determined what could responsibly continue. Darian had wanted a softer story. The evidence left him with the one he earned. At the final trust and board review, nobody bothered pretending the matter was delicate anymore. The room was full, but quieter than before. Lenders sat beside supplier representatives. Civic contacts had come in from the coast. Marcus had the corrected reports stacked in front of him. Evelyn sat at Maricel's right, Violet Penready, and Lenora sat just behind her. Hands folded over her purse. Darian was not there. His name was in the documents. His promises were in the timelines. His overstatements were in the corrected record. But the room no longer needed him present to understand what had happened. A board representative opened with the plainest version anyone had said out loud. For purposes of the record, Vail Urban Resort's stability in these key projects did not come from company control alone. It relied on grant-controlled land access, supplier relationships, credit protections, civic trust, and decisions stewarded by Ms. Grant. No one objected. The lender representative added, our confidence was tied to those protections. We treated them as stable because of the grant structure and MSAs. Grant's judgment. A supplier representative nodded. Our preferred terms were based on relationships that predated Darien Vale's expansion. Then the coastal civic contact spoke. People trusted the Grant name. They trusted Maricel. That's why doors opened. Maricel sat still. But something in her face changed, not pride exactly. Not surprise. More like the release that comes when truth finally stops needing to hide inside your own chest. Marcus looked down at his report. The company benefited from that foundation while presenting Mr. Vale as the sole source of stability. Evelyn glanced at him. Then back to the record. There it was. The full correction. Darian had not built an empire and then generously carried a quiet wife along with him. Maricel's land access, her family relationships, her protected agreements, her caution, her judgment, and her years of uncredited stewardship had created the stability he used to become visible. He had stood on her foundation and called himself self-made. He had taken the shine and left her with the silence. Then he had tried to discard her in front of the same world that benefited from not asking too many questions. Now the question had been answered. Maricel was not the dependent woman lucky to have touched Darian's wealth. Darian had been the visible beneficiary of a foundation she had protected before he ever learned how to sell it as his own genius. No one applauded. They just kept their eyes on the record, where the balance had changed for good. Power rested where it had always rested. Only now it had a name, a record, and witnesses. The final separation documents were thinner than Maricel expected. After all the meetings, all the corrections, all the polite lies dragged into daylight, the marriage ended on paper with a stack that fit neatly inside Evelyn's leather folio. Maricel sat at the conference table with Evelyn on one side and Lenora on the other. Darian's counsel had already signed where he needed to sign. Darian himself was not in the room. That felt right. There was nothing left for him to perform. Evelyn turned the pages carefully. The grant trust protections remain intact, she said. No informal access. No public cover. No silence clause tied to his image. No expectation of cooperation outside proper channels. Maricel nodded. Lenora reached over and touched the edge of the table. Not Maricel's hand, but close enough to remind her she was not alone. Evelyn slid the pen toward her. For a moment, Maricel looked at the signature line. There had been a time when signing the end of this marriage might have felt like failure. Like proof that loyalty had not been enough. Like confirmation that a woman could give years, judgment, discretion, and care, and still be introduced as something a man had outgrown. But the page in front of her did not ask whether Darian loved her. It did not ask whether society had been fair. It asked whether she would keep carrying a version of marriage that gave him roots back to her labor, her silence, her name, and her family's foundation. She picked up the pen. Her signature was steady. Evelyn checked the page, then gave one small nod. That's final, Lenora exhaled softly. Amen. Maricel sat back. No revenge speech came. No tears for Darian. No last-minute softness meant to prove she was graceful enough for people who had mistaken grace for permission. She had kept what was hers. She had refused to be erased. And she had ended the marriage without offering him one more doorway into her protection. From that moment on, Darian's regret belonged to him alone. It had no legal claim on her. No emotional claim. No hidden passage through memory, guilt, or old habit. The door was closed. That Sunday, Maricel returned to the restored Grant family home before anyone else arrived. She opened the front windows, set out coffee, and placed a stack of clean notebooks at the end of the dining table. The house was modest compared to Darian's penthouse, but it held its own kind of wealth. Family photographs, church programs tucked into old books, land maps and flat files. The smell of lemon oil on wood that had been cared for by women who knew ownership was something you protected on ordinary days. Not just dramatic ones. Lenora came first, carrying pound cake wrapped in foil. Evelyn arrived next with a folder under one arm and no patience for being thanked too much. Then came the civic elders, 2 retired educators, a deacon who knew every coastal family by name, and 3 younger women from the Grant network who had asked to learn the trust work properly. They did not gather like people celebrating a scandal. They gathered like people returning to responsibility. Maricel brought out the red leather ledger and set it in the center of the table. For months it had held insults, times, names, exact phrases. Mrs. Vale, previous chapter, household side. Words meant to make her smaller. Preserved because she refused to let anyone rewrite what had been done. Now she opened to a fresh page. Lenora watched her. What are you putting first? Maricel looked around the table. At Evelyn, who had made the record hold. At Lenora, who had reminded her that dignity was not disappearance. At the elders, who remembered the Grant name before Darian ever attached luxury to it. At the younger women, waiting with pens ready, learning that privacy and power did not have to mean silence and erasure. Maricel wrote one line, promises kept. Then she closed the ledger halfway, leaving the page visible. Darian was nowhere in the house. His voice was not on the phone. His image was not on the wall. His regret did not get a chair at the table. Outside, the public story would keep settling. Some people would remember how quickly they had believed the smaller version of her. Some would pretend they had always understood. Some would never admit what they helped shrink. But Maricel no longer needed the world to be honest all at once. The truth had been named. The separation was final. The foundation stood. and this time she stood with it, visible, steady, and fully her own.